The executioner's blade caught the morning light as I stood on the scaffold, and I couldn't help but smile. My younger sister Marianne stood in the crowd below, wearing my mother's sapphire necklace, the one she'd sworn she'd never seen. And I knew with absolute certainty that in exactly 47 seconds, the Duke of Valmont's cavalry would crest the eastern hill. I had died once before on this very scaffold. That time, I hadn't been smiling. "Any last words, traitor?" the royal executor asked, his voice booming across the silent crowd that had gathered in the Capitol Square. "Yes," I said clearly, my voice carrying in the crisp autumn air. "I forgive you all for what you're about to fail to do." Confusion rippled through the crowd. My stepmother, Lady Catherine, stood beside my father, the Duke of Ashford, on the official platform. I watched her face carefully. She thought she'd won. After 16 years of carefully dismantling my life, she believed this was her final triumph. She had no idea I'd already won. The executor raised his blade. I counted silently. 40 v 3. 44, 45. The thunder of hooves echoed across the square. 46, 47. The royal guards turned in confusion as 3,000 mounted soldiers appeared on the ridge, their armor gleaming with the crest of the Valdorian Empire. At their head rode Duke Marquis of Valmont, the man I'd secretly married 6 months ago in my previous life, and 3 weeks ago in this one. "Halt!" His voice was a commander's roar trained to carry across battlefields. "That woman is under the protection of the Valdorian Empire and the personal ward of Empress Celestine herself." The executor's blade froze mid-swing. I'd been 12 years old when I first realized my stepmother wanted me dead. Not merely gone, dead. The distinction mattered. My mother had died when I was 8, killed in a riding accident that I now knew, thanks to the memories of my previous life, had been carefully orchestrated. My father, Duke Edmund of Ashford, remarried within 6 months to Lady Catherine Blackwood, a widow with a daughter my age named Marianne. The abuse started subtly. A misplaced invitation here, a forgotten birthday there. My father, consumed by grief and his new wife's manipulations, barely noticed when I stopped appearing at family dinners. Catherine told him I preferred to eat alone, that I was being difficult about accepting her as my new mother. The truth was that I'd been locked in my room without supper for disrespecting Marianne, who had deliberately broken my mother's music box and blamed me for it. By the time I was 14, I'd been systematically isolated from everyone who might have protected me. My mother's ladies-in-waiting were dismissed. My childhood tutor was replaced with a man who reported everything I said to Catherine. Even my personal maid was Catherine's spy. Marianne, meanwhile, blossomed. She wore my mother's jewelry, slept in my mother's chambers, and was introduced at court as the beloved daughter of the Duke of Ashford. I was relegated to a servant's room in the East Wing and forbidden from attending any social functions. "You'll embarrass us," Catherine would say, her voice dripping with false concern. "You're so awkward, dear, so ungainly. Best you stay home where you're comfortable." My father believed her, or perhaps he simply didn't care enough to look closer. In my first life, I'd endured this treatment until I was 17. That's when Catherine made her final move. She forged documents showing that I'd been selling military secrets to the neighboring kingdom of Thrace. The evidence was perfect. Letters in my handwriting, payment records traced to accounts in my name, even testimony from servants she'd bribed or threatened. I was arrested, tried, and convicted of high treason within a week. My father didn't even attend the trial. I was executed 3 days after my 17th birthday, and Catherine and Marianne inherited everything: my title, my lands, my mother's fortune. I died screaming my innocence to a crowd that didn't care. Then I woke up on my 13th birthday, gasping and sobbing in my childhood bed. It took me 3 days to accept that I'd somehow been given a second chance. The philosophers spoke of reincarnation, of souls returning to right cosmic wrongs. I didn't care about cosmic balance, I cared about revenge. But more importantly, I cared about survival. In my previous life, I'd been passive, accepting each degradation with resignation. I'd believed that if I was good enough, quiet enough, obedient enough, things would improve. That my father would eventually see the truth. That someone would save me. No one had saved me. This time, I would save myself. the first thing I did was start documenting everything. Every insult, every punishment, every stolen piece of jewelry. I kept a journal hidden in a loose floorboard in my room, written in a cipher I'd learned from my old tutor before Catherine dismissed him. The second thing I did was learn everything I could about Catherine's plot. I knew from my previous life that she would make her move when I was 17, that the forged documents would appear in the spring of that year. I had 4 years to prepare. But I also knew something Catherine didn't. In my previous life, after my execution, there had been rumors. Whispers that the evidence had been fabricated, that the handwriting analysis was flawed. These whispers had come from an unlikely source, Duke Marcus of Valmont, a foreign military commander who had been visiting our kingdom as part of a diplomatic delegation. He had attended my trial and been troubled by inconsistencies in the evidence. In my previous life, he'd started his investigation too late to save me, but he'd uncovered enough to disgrace Catherine, 3 years after my death. This time, I wouldn't wait for him to stumble onto the truth. I would bring the truth to him. The turning point came on my 16th birthday, a full year before Catherine would make her move in the original timeline. I'd spent 3 years carefully playing the role of the obedient stepdaughter while secretly gathering evidence. I'd stolen copies of Catherine's correspondence, documented every stolen item, and collected testimony from servants she'd dismissed who were willing to speak truth for the right price. But I needed more. I needed proof that would be believed by the crown, evidence so overwhelming that not even my father's influence could dismiss it. That's when I remembered something from my previous life. Duke Marcus of Valmont had been at court for the spring festival, ostensibly to negotiate trade agreements. But he'd also been gathering intelligence, assessing our military strength, forming connections. He was a man who valued truth and honor, rare qualities in court, and he was powerful enough that even the king listened when he spoke. I needed to become valuable to him before Catherine could destroy me. The plan was audacious and dangerous. During the spring festival, I would sneak into the diplomatic ball, the one Catherine had, of course, forbidden me from attending, and present Duke Marcus with information he desperately needed. Proof that Lord Chancellor Rothwell was planning to betray the kingdom to Thrace, the very crime Catherine would later frame me for. In my previous life, Rothwell's treachery had been discovered 2 years after my death, resulting in a minor war, but I knew about it now, and more importantly, I knew where Rothwell kept his incriminating correspondence. I spent 6 months preparing. I learned to pick locks from a former thief whom I'd helped escape prosecution years ago. He owed me a favor and didn't ask questions. I befriended a seamstress and commissioned a gown that could pass for court fashion. I memorized the layout of Rothwell's estate, which shared a property line with ours. And one moonless night in early spring, I broke into Lord Chancellor Rothwell's study and stole every piece of treasonous correspondence he'd hidden there. The diplomatic ball was held in the royal palace, in the grand ballroom that glittered with 1,000 candles. I arrived late, slipping in through a servant's entrance I'd scouted weeks before, wearing a silver mask that obscured half my face. Duke Marcus of Valmont stood near the eastern windows, a tall figure with dark hair and sharp gray eyes. He was younger than I'd expected, only 28, and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who'd commanded armies since he was 20. I'd died at 17 in my previous life, but I'd lived those 17 years twice now. I was no longer a frightened girl. I was a woman with nothing to lose and everything to gain. I approached him directly, abandoning all pretense of courtly subtlety. "Your Grace," I said quietly in flawless Valdorian, "I have information concerning a plot against both our kingdoms. Lord Chancellor Rothwell is selling military secrets to Thrace. I can prove it." He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "That's quite an accusation to make at a ball, my lady. And you are?" "Someone who will be dead within the year if you don't listen," I said bluntly. "I'm offering you a trade. I give you the evidence that will prevent a war and make you a hero in both kingdoms. You, in turn, ensure my survival when my family tries to execute me for treason." His eyes sharpened. "Why would your family execute you for treason?" "Because they're planning to frame me for the exact crimes Rothwell is actually committing. They need me dead to inherit my mother's title and fortune. But if Rothwell is exposed first, their frame job falls apart, the crown won't believe the same crime was committed twice by 2 different people." I handed him a single letter from my collection. This is dated 3 weeks ago. Rothwell promises Thrace the locations of our northern garrison posts in exchange for 50,000 gold crowns. You can verify the handwriting. You can check the intelligence. I'm certain Thrace has already moved troops based on this information. Duke Marcus read the letter, his face darkening. Where did you get this? I stole it from Rothwell's private study. I have 43 more documents just like it, covering 2 years of correspondence. Troop movements, supply routes, names of spies in our military. Everything you need to hang him and save both our kingdoms from a war he's trying to start. And what do you want in return? Marriage, I said simply. He blinked. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't that. I'm Lady Eleanor of Ashford, first daughter of Duke Edmund and heir to the Ashford title and fortune, I continued. My stepmother and stepsister are planning to have me executed for treason so they can inherit everything. If I'm married to a foreign duke before they make their move, I become untouchable. Executing me would be a diplomatic incident. The marriage doesn't have to be real, I added quickly. It can be annulled later if you wish. I just need the protection of your name and title for the next 2 years. Duke Marcus studied me for a long moment. You're asking me to believe that a young woman? How old are you? 16. That a 16-year-old girl has uncovered a treasonous conspiracy, stolen classified documents from the Lord Chancellor, and is now calmly negotiating a marriage alliance at a diplomatic ball. His tone was skeptical but not dismissive. That strains credulity, Lady Eleanor. Then verify the documents, I challenged. Take them to your intelligence officers. Check the facts. You'll find I'm telling the truth about Rothwell, and if I'm telling the truth about that, I let the implication hang in the air. Why should I trust that you're not a Thracian agent yourself, trying to feed me false information? I'd anticipated this. Question. Because if I were, I'd have brought you information that was easier to verify and less politically explosive. Rothwell is the king's closest advisor. Exposing him will create a scandal that rocks the entire kingdom. A Thracian agent would give you something smaller, more believable, something that wouldn't destabilize our whole government. I met his eyes steadily. I'm bringing you something big because I need something big in return. I need protection from my own family, and only an alliance with foreign power can provide that. Duke Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then he smiled, a slight, dangerous smile. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish. Possibly both. He took the letter. I'll verify your information. If it's genuine, we'll talk about your proposal. Where can I contact you? You can't. I'm not supposed to be here. Send word to Father Benedict at the Church of St. Aldrich in the lower city. He's an old friend of my mother's and one of the few people my stepmother doesn't control. I'll check with him daily. And the rest of the documents? You get them when we have an agreement. Insurance, Your Grace, I'm sure you understand. He laughed, a genuine sound of surprised respect. I do indeed. Very well. Lady Eleanor of Ashford, I'll be in touch. I left the ball the same way I'd entered, my heart pounding with exhilaration and terror. I'd set events in motion that couldn't be undone. Either Duke Marcus would verify my information and help me, or he'd dismiss me as a lunatic and I'd have wasted my best chance at survival. 3 days later, Father Benedict gave me a sealed letter with the Valmont crest. Duke Marcus had verified everything. Thracian troop movements matched exactly what Rothwell had promised to provide. The handwriting was genuine. The intelligence was actionable. And Duke Marcus of Valmont was willing to marry me. The wedding was conducted in secret in Father Benedict's church with only 3 witnesses: Father Benedict himself, Duke Marcus's personal guard, and my old childhood maid Agnes, who had been dismissed by Catherine years ago but still lived in the lower city. This is highly irregular, Father Benedict said nervously as he performed the ceremony. A marriage without the bride's father's consent. I'm 16 and heir to a duchy, I interrupted. Under kingdom law, I have the right to marry without consent if I believe my life is in danger from my family. This marriage is legal, Father, and you know it. It was legal, though barely. It was a provision in very old laws designed to protect noble daughters from being murdered for their inheritances. Few people remembered it existed. Catherine certainly didn't. Duke Marcus placed a simple gold ring on my finger. Do you take me as your husband, Eleanor of Ashford? I do. Then you are Eleanor of Valmont now, and under the protection of the Valdorian Empire. No one can touch you. I'd expected to feel nothing. This was a business arrangement after all, a strategic alliance for survival. But as the ring settled on my finger, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 lifetimes. Safety. For the first time since my mother died, I wasn't alone. The following week, Duke Marcus presented his evidence to the king in a private audience. Lord Chancellor Rothwell was arrested, his estate seized, his family disgraced. The documents I'd provided prevented a war and saved thousands of lives. The king was grateful. Duke Marcus was celebrated as a hero of both kingdoms. And I, still hidden and supposedly unmarried, waited for Catherine to make her move. She did exactly what I knew she would. 6 months after Rothwell's arrest, almost precisely when she'd done it in my previous life, Catherine discovered evidence that I was selling secrets to Thrace. The same forged letters, the same fake payment records, the same bribed servants offering testimony. But this time, there was a problem. The Crown had just prosecuted someone for this exact crime. The intelligence community was hypersensitive to the issue, and when my father brought the charges against me to the royal court, demanding my arrest and trial, the king's investigators actually looked at the evidence carefully. It took them less than a week to determine the documents were forgeries. The handwriting analysis showed inconsistencies. The payment records used account numbers that hadn't existed during the dates on the letters. One of the servants who testified against me was actually a known forger whom Catherine had hired. And then Duke Marcus of Valmont stepped forward and dropped the final hammer. The woman you're accusing of treason is my wife. She's been under Valdorian protection for 6 months. These charges are an obvious attempt to murder a foreign duchess for her inheritance. I'd never seen my father's face turn that particular shade of purple before. The king was furious. Attempting to execute a foreign duchess on fabricated charges wasn't just criminal, it was an act of war. The investigation turned on Catherine and Marianne with savage speed. My hidden journals were discovered during the search of Ashford Manor. I'd made sure to leave them somewhere investigators would find them. 3 years of documented abuse, stolen jewelry, forged correspondence. Former servants came forward, eager to testify now that Catherine's power was broken. The case was airtight. Catherine and Marianne were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, theft, and attempted treason. My father, deemed complicit through negligence, was stripped of his titles and lands, and I, Eleanor of Valmont, formerly Eleanor of Ashford, became the Duchess of Ashford in my own right. But I wasn't satisfied with merely surviving this time. I wanted complete victory. I wanted the vindication I'd been denied in my first life. The trial was held in the same courthouse where, I'd been convicted of treason in my previous life. The irony was delicious. Catherine stood in chains where I had once stood, her face pale and drawn. Marianne sobbed beside her, the sapphire necklace, my mother's necklace, seized as evidence and returned to me. Lady Catherine Blackwood, the judge intoned, you are charged with conspiracy to commit murder, multiple counts of fraud and theft, and attempted treason through false accusation. How do you plead? Not guilty, Catherine said, her voice still carrying that aristocratic hauteur even now. This is all a misunderstanding. Eleanor has always been troubled, dramatic. She's fabricated these charges because she resents my daughter. Be silent, the judge snapped. We have reviewed 3 years of documented evidence. We have testimony from 17 witnesses. We have the stolen items recovered from your chambers. Your guilt is not in question. This proceeding is merely to determine your sentence. I watched from the gallery as Catherine's face finally crumbled as the reality of her situation broke through her delusions of control. She'd spent years believing she was untouchable, that her manipulations were invisible, that her intelligence made her superior to everyone around her. She'd never considered that her victim might be smarter. The judge continued. Additionally, we have uncovered evidence that you orchestrated the death of Duchess Margaret of Ashford 8 years ago. The riding accident was, in fact, deliberate sabotage. My hands clenched. I'd suspected, but having it confirmed, having my mother's murder acknowledged, was both vindicating and agonizing. You will be hanged for murder and attempted murder, the judge declared. Your daughter, Marianne Blackwood, will be imprisoned for 15 years for her complicity in these crimes. All assets acquired through your marriage to Duke Edmund will be forfeit and returned to the Ashford estate. Catherine screamed then, a raw sound of rage and denial. She's stolen everything. That little bitch has stolen my life. I gave her everything, a home, a family. You gave her nothing but cruelty and abuse, Duke Marcus said coldly from beside me. He'd insisted on attending the trial. You murdered her mother, stole her inheritance, and attempted to execute her for crimes you fabricated. You deserve far worse than hanging. As the guards dragged Catherine from the courtroom, still screaming, I felt the weight of my first life finally lifting. The woman who had killed my mother and murdered me was facing justice. Real, undeniable justice. But I wasn't finished. My father's trial was quieter, more pathetic. Duke Edmund of Ashford, stripped of his title, stood before the court looking decades older than his 43 years. I didn't know, he kept saying. I didn't know what Catherine was doing. I thought Eleanor was just being difficult, that she needed discipline. You didn't want to know, I said, standing to address the court. I'd earned the right to speak. You chose ignorance because it was easier than admitting you'd married a monster. You chose your new wife over your daughter's welfare. You ignored every sign of abuse because acknowledging it would have required you to take action, to be uncomfortable, to parent your grieving child. My father looked at me then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in 8 years. Eleanor, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I loved your mother, and after she died, I was lost. Then you should have protected the child she left behind, I said, my voice steady and cold. Instead, you abandoned me to be raised by her murderer. There is no forgiveness for that. The court stripped my father of all titles and lands, which reverted to me as my mother's heir. He was banished from the capital and forbidden from contacting me. His assets were seized to pay restitution. He left the courtroom a broken man, and I felt nothing but relief. Reclaiming Ashford Manor felt like stepping back in time. The last time I'd lived here, in both lifetimes, I'd been a prisoner in my own home. Now I walked through the halls as its duchess and owner, with Duke Marcus beside me and a full staff who answered to me alone. I had Catherine's chambers emptied and burned everything inside. I reclaimed my mother's jewelry from the evidence lockers. I moved into my mother's old suite and spent the first night in 8 years sleeping peacefully. But my victory wasn't just about reclaiming property, it was about building something better. With my mother's fortune and my new husband's connections, I established a foundation to help other young women trapped in abusive family situations. I created legal pathways for daughters to claim their inheritances without their father's consent when abuse was documented. I funded investigators who specialized in uncovering fraud and corruption in noble families. I used my second chance at life to make sure other girls wouldn't need one. Duke Marcus, to my surprise, became more than just a strategic ally. Our marriage, which had started as pure convenience, slowly transformed into genuine partnership. He respected my intelligence, valued my counsel, and never once tried to diminish my authority or control my choices. You know, he said one evening as we reviewed petitions in my study, when you first approached me at that ball, I thought you were absolutely insane. I laughed. That's fair, it was an insane plan. But it was also brilliant. You assessed your resources, identified your advantages, and executed a strategy that saved your life and prevented a war. You're a better tactician than most of my military commanders. I had an unfair advantage, I said, thinking of the memories from my previous life. I knew what was coming. Knowledge is only useful if you have the courage and intelligence to act on it. Many people know things and do nothing. You risked everything on a gamble that I would believe you, that your information would check out, that the law could be manipulated in your favor. That takes more than knowledge. That takes genius. I felt my cheeks warm. In 2 lifetimes, no one had ever called me brilliant. I'd been dismissed, underestimated, and overlooked by everyone except this man, who had agreed to marry a desperate 16-year-old girl because she'd had the audacity to offer him something valuable. Thank you, I said softly, for believing me, for saving me. You saved yourself, Marcus corrected. I just provided the diplomatic immunity. Everything else, the evidence gathering, the strategy, the execution, That was all you." He was right, and I knew it. But it still felt good to be acknowledged. Catherine's execution was held on a cold autumn morning, exactly 1 year after she tried to have me executed. I attended, though many people thought it was beneath a duchess's dignity to witness such things. I needed to see it. I needed to know with absolute certainty that she was gone and could never hurt anyone again. She was led to the scaffold, the same one where I had died in my first life, in chains. The crowd was enormous. Catherine had been a popular figure in court society, and her fall had been spectacular. People had come to witness the end of a woman who had fooled them all. As she climbed the steps, Catherine saw me in the crowd. Our eyes met. "You little bitch," she spat, her aristocratic composure finally shattered completely. "You were supposed to die. I was perfect. My plan was perfect. You were supposed to die, and I was supposed to have everything." "I did die," I said, loud enough for her to hear. "And you did have everything. For about 3 years. Then karma caught up with you." She wouldn't understand what I meant. No one could, but saying it felt like closing a circle. The executioner asked if she had any last words. "This isn't justice," Catherine screamed. "She's a witch. She knew things she couldn't have known. She planned this. She manipulated everyone. The blade fell. I watched until it was over, then turned and walked away. Marcus fell into step beside me, offering his arm. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. "Free," I said. And I meant it. Marianne's imprisonment was, in some ways, worse than Catherine's execution. She was kept in a reasonable but stark cell with no luxuries and no contact with her former social circle. Every day she had to face the reality that her privileged life had been built on crimes and cruelty. I visited her once 3 months after Catherine's death. She looked terrible, thin, pale, her hair lank and unwashed. The beautiful stepsister who had stolen my mother's jewelry and my father's love was gone. In her place was a broken woman who barely looked up when I entered her cell. "Why are you here?" she asked dully. "To see if you understand what you did wrong." She laughed bitterly. "I understand that I picked the wrong sister to bully, that I should have been nicer to you so you wouldn't destroy my entire life." "That's not understanding," I said. "That's just regret that you got caught." "What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? That I feel terrible about how we treated you?" Her voice rose, becoming shrill. "Fine, I'm sorry. I'm sorry we locked you in your room and stole your jewelry and blamed you for things you didn't do. Are you happy now?" "Do you understand why it was wrong?" I pressed. "Not because you got caught, not because there were consequences, but why it was wrong to treat another human being, your stepsister, with such cruelty." Marianne was quiet for a long time. Then she said in a small voice, "Mother said you deserved it. That you were ungrateful and difficult, that we were teaching you discipline. And did you ever stop to question whether that was true?" "No," she admitted. "I didn't want to. It was easier to believe Mother. And besides, you had things I wanted, the title, the inheritance. Father loved you first, and I hated that. Mother said we could have everything if you were gone. It was the most honest she'd ever been with me." "That's not love," I said quietly. "What Catherine gave you wasn't love. It was a conspiracy that turned you into a criminal before you were old enough to understand what you were doing." "Are you trying to make me feel better?" Marianne asked bitterly. "No, I'm trying to make you understand that you were a victim too in a different way. Catherine used you as a weapon against me. She destroyed both our childhoods." "I still chose to hurt you," Marianne said. "Every time I took something that was yours, every time I lied about you, every time I watched Mother punish you and said nothing, I chose that. I wanted to be the favorite. I wanted everything you had." "Yes," I agreed. "You did choose that, and now you're facing the consequences. 15 years is a long time to think about your choices." "Will you ever forgive me?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. In my first life, I died screaming my innocence, betrayed by my family, alone and terrified. In this life, I'd reclaimed everything and then some. I had power, wealth, a partner who respected me, and a future full of possibilities. I don't need to forgive you, I said finally. Forgiveness would imply that I'm still carrying the weight of what you did to me. I'm not. I've moved on. I've built a life that's better than anything you or Catherine could have imagined. Whether you find peace with your actions is your problem, not mine. I left the prison and never went back. Marianne served her full sentence, and I heard years later that she'd become a very different person. Quieter, kinder, devoted to charity work. But I never sought her out, and she never tried to contact me. Some wounds, even healed, leave scars that make certain relationships impossible. 5 years after Catherine's execution, Marcus and Emma, I had our first child, a daughter with his dark hair and my green eyes. We named her Margaret after my mother. I held her in my arms in the Ashford nursery, the same room where I'd played as a child before Catherine arrived, and felt the final piece of my revenge click into place. This wasn't just about punishing Catherine and reclaiming what was mine. It was about building a future where my daughter would never experience what I had, where she would grow up knowing she was loved, protected, and valued, where her inheritance would be secure and her choices would be her own. She's perfect, Marcus said, looking over my shoulder at our sleeping daughter. She's safe, I corrected. That's what matters most. The Ashford Duchy flourished under my leadership. I modernized our agricultural practices, invested in infrastructure, and created educational opportunities for children from poor families. The lands that Catherine had nearly bankrupted with her embezzling became prosperous again. I also used my position to push for legal reforms. The old law that had allowed me to marry without my father's consent became more widely known and used by other young women in desperate situations. I funded legal advocates who specialized in inheritance law and family abuse cases. Every girl I helped felt like another victory over Catherine's ghost. My father died when I was 23, alone and forgotten in a small village on the border. I was informed of his passing by a clerk who assumed I'd want to know. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no grief, no closure. He'd made his choices, and he'd lived with the consequences. I didn't attend his funeral. Duke Marcus proved to be an exceptional partner in every way. Our marriage, which had begun as a strategic necessity, became something I'd never expected. Genuine love. He encouraged my ambitions, supported my reforms, and never once tried to diminish my authority as Duchess of Ashford. You know, I told him one evening as we celebrated our 10th anniversary, when I proposed to you at that ball, I thought this would be purely transactional, a business arrangement. And now? He asked, smiling. Now I can't imagine my life without you. You're my best friend, my closest advisor, my greatest ally. You believed in me when I was a desperate teenager with an impossible story. You gave me the protection I needed to fight back. You never tried to take control or diminish what I'd accomplished. You made it very easy to believe in you, Marcus said. You walked up to a foreign duke at a diplomatic ball and proposed marriage in exchange for intelligence about a treasonous conspiracy. You were the bravest, most audacious person I'd ever met. How could I not fall in love with someone like that? I was terrified, I admitted. Every second of that conversation, I was certain you'd call the guards and have me thrown out as a lunatic. I very nearly did, Marcus admitted. But there was something in your eyes, a certainty. You knew your information was real and you knew what you needed to survive. That kind of clarity is rare. I decided to take a chance on you. Best decision you ever made? I teased. Unquestionably, he said, pulling me close. You've made me a better leader, a better man, and a better father. Our daughter is growing up watching her mother run a duchy with wisdom and strength. That's a legacy that matters more than any military victory I've ever achieved. As our children grew, we eventually had 3 daughters and a son. I made sure each of them understood the value of using power responsibly. I told them edited versions of my story, carefully omitting the impossible parts about my second chance at life, but emphasizing the importance of standing up to injustice, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and never underestimating someone just because they seemed powerless. My eldest daughter, Margaret, inherited the Ashford Duchy when she came of age. I watched her grow into a leader even more capable than I'd been, and I knew that my mother's legacy and my own was in excellent hands. On my 40th birthday, I stood on the balcony of Ashford Manor, looking out over lands that were thriving and prosperous. Marcus stood beside me, our youngest son playing at our feet, our daughters off pursuing their own ambitions. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked quietly. "The way everything happened? The manipulation, the revenge, the calculated ruthlessness of it all?" I thought about his question carefully. I'd spent 2 lifetimes dealing with the consequences of my choices, or in the first life, my lack of choices. "No," I said finally. "I did what I had to do to survive. Catherine and Marianne made their choices freely. No one forced them to abuse me, to steal from me, to try to murder me. They created the situation. I just refused to be their victim a second time." "A second time," Marcus repeated softly. He'd never fully understood what I meant by that phrase, but he'd stopped asking for clarification years ago. "I mean figuratively," I said smoothly. "I'd already been their victim for years. I refused to let them victimize me further." "You're a terrible liar," Marcus said fondly, "but I've learned not to push for answers you're not ready to give." I smiled and squeezed his hand. Some secrets were too impossible to share, even with the person I loved most in the world. The final piece of my revenge came 23 years after Catherine's execution. The Royal College of Historians published a comprehensive account of her crimes, ensuring that her name would be forever associated with treachery, cruelty, and murder. The textbook account of the Ashford conspiracy was taught to every law student as a case study in how abuse of power and family manipulation could lead to catastrophic consequences. Catherine had wanted to be remembered as a Grand Duchess, a powerful matriarch, a woman of influence, and grace. Instead, she became a cautionary tale, her name synonymous with evil stepmother archetypes for generations. I didn't feel triumphant when I read the historical account. I felt closure. The girl who had died screaming on a scaffold in another timeline was finally completely avenged. Not just through Catherine's execution, but through the complete erasure of everything she'd tried to build. Her legacy was shame. Mine was prosperity and reform. When I turned 50, I officially retired from active management of the duchy, passing full authority to Margaret. Marcus and I split our time between Ashford Manor and his family's estates in Valdoria, enjoying the rare luxury of peaceful old age. One afternoon, as we sat in the garden watching our grandchildren play, Marcus said something that caught me off guard. "I've been thinking about the day we met, that ball 23 years ago." "That's a dangerous pastime," I teased. "You told me you'd be dead within the year if I didn't help you. You were so certain, so specific." He turned to look at me directly. "Eleanor, I've spent 2 decades watching you. You don't just predict things, you know them. You knew exactly when Catherine would make her move. You knew about Rothwell's treachery before anyone else. You knew things a 16-year-old girl shouldn't have been able to know." My heart began to race. "I was observant. I gathered intelligence." "You gathered intelligence about events that hadn't happened yet," Marcus interrupted gently. "I'm not a fool, Eleanor. I've commanded armies, run intelligence networks, negotiated with some of the most cunning political minds in 2 kingdoms. And I'm telling you that what you accomplished, the precision of your knowledge, the perfect timing of your interventions, it wasn't just intelligence gathering." I was silent for a long moment. Then I said quietly, "If I told you something impossible, would you believe me? After 23 years of marriage, I'd believe almost anything you told me." So I told him. Everything. About dying on the scaffold at 17, about waking up on my 13th birthday with memories of a life I'd already lived, about using that knowledge to change everything. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for a very long time. "That's," he began, then stopped. "That explains so much. The certainty in your eyes that first night. The way you knew exactly what evidence to steal and when. The precision of your planning." He shook his head in wonder. "You lived through your own murder and came back to prevent it. You believe me? I married you based on intelligence you stole from the Lord Chancellor's private study when you were 16 years old," Marcus said dryly. You've spent 23 years demonstrating that you're capable of impossible things. Why would I doubt you now? I felt tears prick my eyes. I've never told anyone. I couldn't. Who would believe such a thing? I believe you, Marcus said, firmly taking my hand, and I'm honored that you trusted me with the truth. Does it change anything? Does it matter how you gained the knowledge, when you used it to save your own life, prevent a war, and build something good? I don't know, I admitted. Sometimes I wonder if I cheated somehow, if using knowledge from another life to manipulate events was wrong. Catherine murdered your mother and tried to murder you, Marcus said bluntly. She would have succeeded if you hadn't fought back with every advantage you had. You didn't create the situation, you just refused to die in it. There's no moral ambiguity in that. I've spent 23 years wondering if I should feel guilty. And do you? I thought about my mother, who died in a riding accident that was really murder. I thought about the girl I'd been in my first life, screaming her innocence as the blade fell. I thought about Marianne, molded into a weapon by her mother's cruelty. I thought about all the girls I'd helped through my legal reforms and charitable work. No, I said finally. I don't feel guilty, I feel grateful. I was given a second chance that no one else gets, and I used it to build something better. Marcus kissed my hand. Then that's all that matters. We sat in comfortable silence, watching our grandchildren play in the garden, where I'd once played with my own mother a lifetime ago. I lived to be 73 years old, 56 years longer than I'd lived in my first life. Marcus passed away 2 years before me, peacefully in his sleep, and I mourned him deeply. He'd been my partner, my protector, and the man who'd believed me when I'd had nothing but an impossible story and stolen documents. On my deathbed, surrounded by my children and grandchildren, I felt at peace in a way I'd never expected. The girl who'd died young and angry and betrayed had lived a full, rich, triumphant second life. My daughter Margaret held my hand as my breathing grew shallow. "Mother," she said softly, "you've lived an extraordinary life. The duchy is thriving. Your legal reforms have helped thousands of women. Your grandchildren adore you. You've accomplished so much." "I accomplished survival," I said, my voice weak but clear. "Everything else was just bonus." "You accomplished more than survival," my eldest grandson said. He was studying law at the Royal College and had written his thesis on the Ashford conspiracy. "You changed the entire legal framework around inheritance and family law. You created precedents that protect vulnerable heirs. Historians will study your life for centuries." I smiled at that. Let them study. Let them debate how a 16-year-old girl had possessed such perfect intelligence and such flawless timing. Let them wonder at the precision of my revenge and the completeness of my victory. They would never know the truth, that I'd lived it all before, that I'd died screaming and come back determined never to be a victim again. Some secrets were mine alone. As my vision began to fade, I thought about Catherine one last time. In another timeline, she'd won. She'd murdered me and stolen everything and lived happily with her daughter in my mother's house, wearing my mother's jewelry, spending my inheritance. In this timeline, she'd died on a scaffold, disgraced and defeated, her name a byword for evil. I'd promised myself, when I woke up on my 13th birthday, that I would survive, that I would win, that I would make them pay for every moment of cruelty, every stolen piece of jewelry, every locked door and missed meal and crushing humiliation. I'd kept that promise. The last thing I saw before darkness took me was Margaret's face, strong and capable, the face of a woman who'd grown up knowing she was loved and protected. My mother's name, living on in a granddaughter who would never know what it meant to be powerless. I died the second time peacefully, surrounded by love, having lived a life full of purpose and triumph. The difference between my two deaths was everything. In the years after my death, the full scope of what I'd accomplished became clear to historians and legal scholars. The Ashford reforms, as they came to be called, fundamentally changed how inheritance law worked in the kingdom. My foundation continued to operate for over a century, helping countless young women escape abusive situations. The story of how I'd outmaneuvered Catherine became legendary, though the official version attributed my success to remarkable foresight and intelligence gathering. rather than knowledge from a previous life. Ballads were written about the clever duchess who'd turned the tables on her murderous stepmother. Plays dramatized the courtroom confrontations. Catherine's name became proverbial. Don't be a Catherine meant don't let ambition override decency. Catherine's end referred to a deserved comeuppance. The historical record ensured that her legacy was exactly what she'd feared most: irrelevance and infamy. Marianne, who outlived me by 5 years, spent her final decades in quiet charity work. She never spoke publicly about her crimes or her mother. When she died, her small estate was donated to my foundation, her final acknowledgement, perhaps, that I'd been right and she'd been wrong. My father's legacy was simply erasure. He was mentioned in historical texts only as the neglectful duke whose inattention enabled his wife's crimes. No statues, no honors, no remembrance, just a footnote in someone else's tragedy. But my legacy, the legacy of Eleanor of Valmont, Duchess of Ashford, that endured. The Ashford Duchy remained prosperous for generations. My descendants continued the tradition of using their power to protect the vulnerable and reform unjust systems. The legal precedents I'd established saved countless lives. And somewhere in the historical record, buried in the details of trial transcripts and witness testimonies, was the truth that a 16-year-old girl had walked up to a foreign duke at a ball and proposed marriage in exchange for intelligence about a treasonous conspiracy, that she'd stolen documents from the Lord Chancellor's study, that she'd known, with impossible precision, exactly when and how her family would try to kill her, that she'd orchestrated one of the most complete and devastating revenges in the kingdom's history. Future generations would study my life and debate how I'd done it. Some would attribute it to genius, others to luck, a few to divine intervention. None would guess the truth, that I'd lived it all before, that I'd been given the rarest gift imaginable, a second chance, and I'd used it to transform from victim to victor. The girl who had died screaming on a scaffold had become the woman who'd changed a kingdom. And in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all. Not just surviving, not just winning, but using my second chance to ensure that what happened to me would never happen to anyone else. Catherine had tried to erase me from history. Instead, I'd erased her. And when historians looked back at the Ashford conspiracy centuries later, they saw exactly what I'd intended them to see: a cautionary tale about the dangers of cruelty, a triumph of justice over tyranny, and proof that even the most powerless victim could become an unstoppable force if given the knowledge and courage to fight back. I'd been given an unfair advantage, knowledge from a previous life, and I'd used it without mercy or hesitation to reclaim everything that had been stolen from me, and then some. I'd lived 2 lives, one as a victim, one as a victor, and the second life, the one I'd fought for and won through cunning and courage and the impossible gift of foreknowledge, had been glorious. That scaffold where I'd died once and nearly died again became a monument to judicial reform. A plaque commemorated the victims of false accusations and family abuse. My name was listed first, but I hadn't ended up on that scaffold the second time. I'd stood in the crowd and watched my murderer face the justice I'd been denied. And then I'd walked away, free and victorious, to build a life worth living. That was the story. That was the revenge. That was the triumph. And it was complete.